we head towards the latter part of this week. Just some reminders on schedule matters. I'm going to uh, start the opioid section today. Knowing the way I blab on about things, I probably won't get finished with it, but I've built some flex into the end of the schedule toward the very last days of the course. So what we don't get done on opioids today, I'll continue with that there in that last week, as well as cover the antidepressants and some toxicology. So remember from what we talked about yesterday, for the upcoming third exam, which is a week from tomorrow, that would be Friday, November 6th, 3 p.m. in the Urey Lecture Hall, that the coverage will not include opioids. Opioids will be on exam 4. So that when we finished up with the antipsychotics yesterday, that was the end of coverage for exam 3. Um, so I think I'll open it up, see if anybody has any questions, comments, additions, current events. If you've been following the voter situation in the country, it's really interesting. As of, I think, last evening, something like 73 million people had already voted um, across the country. And there's still a few days to go before um, election day on Tuesday, which, by the way, of course, Tuesday is one of our class days, so we won't have class that day. Monday is not a usual class day anyway. So next week we'll pick up again with Katie's material on Wednesday. Anybody have any questions? Okay, well, this presentation that we're about to initiate, I actually put it together for another occasion a year or so ago, a presentation to the WWAMI medical group, and had some particular purposes in mind when I put this presentation together. It's a little bit different than what I would sort of normally do for this particular class that we're sharing right now. But nevertheless, I think some of the historical aspects of this area are important to us, considering the challenges that have been faced nationally with respect to opioids in recent years. So there's a distinctly historical bent to the presentation. I'll try to not overdo that too much. Buried within that is the substantial pharmacology and toxicology that's of interest to us relative to this absolutely incredible class of pharmaceutical substances. As I think we've talked about a little bit in the past, uh, with perhaps the exception of the general anesthetics, I'm not sure there's any area that's more classical in pharmacology than the opioid area. And of course, there is some overlap between the general anesthetic and opioid areas, which has been discussed already, but we'll talk about that a little bit more as we proceed. So there's a lot in this presentation. Some of it I'll skip through pretty fast because you folks have already been oriented um, to those particular areas. Other places I'll slow down and do some pretty discrete coverage as far as these substances are concerned. So did I hear any interest in questions there, or should we head on? Okay, well, few of my different types of slides to start with here. I don't know how well you can see this, but um, this is a monastery way up in the mountains of Greece, and I just found this to be a particularly compelling photograph. Same with the next one here in terms of compelling. It's a encampment in the late 19th or early 20th century, and I found some tremendous tranquility in this particular picture. So if you're having a particularly stressful week, perhaps the tranquility of this scenery will help a little bit in terms of getting you a little relief from the stress. And here's a little doggy that came to class a couple years ago. Seamus is the dog's name, and it was a real nice little visit. Seamus was a good little doggy throughout the lecture presentation and brightened up everybody's day then. So I thought he might brighten up your day right now. Okay, well, quickly do some acknowledgments here. This presentation is not only mine, but contributions from a number of other people that deserve credit. And one of those was, I don't know if any of you people know him or not, Pierce Mullen, who's a historian of science down at MSU Bozeman and was the organizer of the symposium that this particular work was prepared for. So you could do an acknowledgement slide like this on any one of the presentations that we do. It's always a joint effort. It's ourselves and others that are involved in terms of putting that all together. I don't know if any of you can see the black cat or not. She's wandering around in the window behind me here. One of our other cats, Hipshot, is also at the door meowing for more lunch, but he finished that already. So I've tried to mark some particular things in this presentation with some letters or symbols. If you see an HP, it means that it's a particularly historic point from my viewpoint. If you see a star, then that's more the pharmacology that we're interested in this particular course that we're dealing with today. An EO referring to endogenous opioids and an OR to opioid receptors. And as far as some of the aspects of opioid pharmacology, some more of that will be presented at the very end of the course also. So I'll do some of that today, and then there'll be some of it coming a little bit later. So this is just a graphic of some changes that have occurred in the United States over about the last 20 years in terms of problems associated with opioids, as well as other depressant drugs. And it's quite a dramatic change in overdoses that have occurred in these areas in recent decades, and that's reflected by the two sort of colorful views of various parts of the country going back to the turn of the millennium. And then the latest that I have here is 2015. So even though the opioid area is a long-standing and traditional one in pharmacology, there certainly are changes that have occurred in recent times. And these changes, have to do directly with respect to the drugs in one sense, but in other senses are more sociological changes than they are pharmacological. And so we'll try to maybe tease apart some of those differences a little bit as we go along. Make sure and jump in if you have questions along the way. I'm sort of not one that keeps good tabs on the chat, but if you just jump into our regular presentation, if you have something that you'd like to ask, please, or contribute otherwise, please feel free to do so. So this is just a graphic of like we've seen before, where we're looking at PubMed citations in certain areas. Um, Note that it how you actually add these things up is going to determine the absolute value of the number. And so you could easily come in with a notation in which general anesthetics would top the list, and the opioids would be a little bit um, farther behind. So it does depend on how you count. No matter how you count, though, the anesthetic and opioid areas are hugely subscribed in terms of research and clinical interest um, in these areas. One little note in terms of some nomenclature, um, you will run into the terminology of opioids and opiates. Um, some people consider those to be uh, completely synonymous words. Other people divide them out a little bit, and some folks put opioids as sort of the more general category of all opioid drugs, whereas opiates are often considered to be more in terms of the natural products, which are substantial in the category. But however you define that, um, there is a lot of interest and many citations in these particular areas. And for the most part, I'll probably just refer to everything as opioids. Well, there's of course some beautiful plant-related aspects of the natural products. And here's a gorgeous view of a poppy. And of course, there are opium containing poppies and non-opium containing poppies. So even though all poppies are gorgeous in a botanical sense, not all of them are carriers of the genes which are responsible for ultimate readout and synthesis of the naturally occurring opioids, which in a general sense, of course, have been recognized for a very long period of time. And I don't know if that's the next slide. Well, here's another one on sort of um, the more pharmaceutical aspects of of opium poppies. And here's sort of the historical slide I was looking for a second ago. Um, I put this in to remind ourselves that even though the scientific specifics of opium are mostly known from the last century or so, um, as a cultural natural product, the opioids have been recognized by humans as being significant contributors to pain relief and other sensory related phenomena such as anesthesia for a long time. And if we go back 200 years, for example, beyond the ether dome in Harvard, but before that, uh, really the only um, really anesthetic agents that we had available were ethyl alcohol and opium. So it's certainly not an exaggeration to say that there's been a significant cultural and scientific history for opium, both naturally occurring and then, of course, later on synthetic. Well, there's the ether dome in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or maybe it's Boston. I'm not sure. I've not seen it myself. I'm not sure where the exact location is, but Cambridge is just a part of Boston anyway, is my understanding. This is a very famous picture that we've talked about before in terms of the history of pharmacology, about 1850, when the first successful scientific efforts at anesthesia occurred. And before that, and to this very moment in which we're in today, um, opioids have played a significant role in terms of pharmacy and medical practice and dental practice. Well, this is a bit of a slanted slide here in terms of particular institutions. This is their front row center is Eddie Way again, who you've seen slides of before in my presentations. And Eddie, or his longer name is E. Leong Way, um, was the head principal investigator scientifically of a very large group of opioid scientists at the University of California. And he, from really about the 1950s through really just a few years ago when he passed away, this was a prominent opioid group. And I mention it particularly because uh, Bert Katzung and Tony Trevor from our textbook were colleagues of Dr. Way in this group. Of course, there are many other groups worldwide that have contributed to our understanding of opioid pharmacology, and a number of people in this particular slide who were Dr. Way's students or colleagues as research scientists have contributed to the opioid advancements over the years. I won't take the time to point out who these individuals are, but maybe you could take my word for it. So there's a bit of a connection here in terms of our Katzung textbook and this opioid group. But I would say through about the 1970s, at least, this opioid group at UCSF was a very, very prominent group worldwide in terms of learning more about why opioids act the way they do and what the particular aspects of their utility as well as their danger are, all of which have been subject to intense scientific discovery over the years. So here's just some written out in words, some historical points that I think are relevant as far as the opioids are concerned. As you can see from first bullet point there, the incredible activity of these substances has been known for a very long period of time. As we began to enter the scientific era, Paracelsus, who is one of the significant parents, if you will, of modern pharmacology, whether we're talking about opium or other substances, reintroduced the tar of opium, poppy juice, to Western scientific thought. And then a little bit later than that, a little over 200 years ago now, the actual isolation of morphine occurred. And again, that's a very deserving effort in terms of praise, because that chemical isolation and characterization was done, of course, without the tools that are available in 2020 to do such molecular investigations. It was quite some time, however, before the world moved beyond the natural products and into the synthetic realm as far as the opioids were concerned. And in the years leading into World War II and then afterwards, synthetics became a big part of opioid pharmacology. Methadone and meperidine were examples of synthetics which were identified about that time. So in the range of 75 to not quite 100 years ago, we're talking about the introduction of the synthetics, which is ongoing today, and we'll certainly have some points about developments that are occurring in that particular realm as we proceed throughout this presentation that we're doing today. The development of antagonists was a very significant matter in this particular realm. In around the middle of the 20th century, the first really pretty dedicated opioid antagonist in nalorphine was introduced. Naloxone, which we're all familiar with today, came a little bit after that, and that was a significant advancement in itself. In that nalorphine is not completely an antagonist. I mean, it mostly is, but there's just a shred of agonistic activity left there in nalorphine, whereas naloxone, uh, on the other hand, is often referred to as a more pure antagonist in having um, nearly zero intrinsic activity from an agonistic side. So those were very significant events as far as the drugs themselves are concerned. As far as the targets are concerned, that was a little bit later on. And Candace Pert and Saul Snyder in the very early 1970s um, were the first to identify, but certainly not the last to work with um, opioid receptors. And about the same time, they were almost simultaneous discoveries, but not quite. A number of groups worldwide, including Avram Goldstein at Stanford, um, uh, discovered the presence of endogenous opioid substances in our systems, and all of these events of the endogenous substances themselves and the target receptors uh, really shed a different light on the drug substances themselves in terms of how they were able to elicit the specific activities that they do, which are so important as far as pain relief, especially, but of course, uh, other aspects of opioids too are important. Um, so these are a few, not all by any means, but a few of the hallmarks of historical presentation as far as the opioids are concerned. And it's important history beyond the opioids. It's important as far as pharmacology overall is concerned, because many of the principles of pharmacological action that we understand with respect to a variety of drug classifications are actually due to initial studies that occurred with respect to morphine, its analogs, and then later on the synthetics. Well, I think we've also talked a little bit along the way here this semester, but we'll do just a little bit more with it. I'm not going to spend a long time on this particular area because we could easily take the whole hour in doing it. But of course, um, the tremendous pharmacology of the opioids suggests a significant need for regulatory phenomena, which has occurred not only in the United States, but of course elsewhere in the world. But with respect to the United States regulatory environment for opioids, some of the significant aspects of that are listed in this particular slide, including, especially with respect to opioids, the Harrison Act of 1914, which of course was just slightly later than the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. So the Pure Foods and Drugs Act, of course, is uh, a much broader piece of legislation than the Harrison Act is. But if you're looking for relatively specific uh, control aspects, that dates to the Harrison Act of 1914. Just to remind you that with respect to the Pure Food and Drugs Act, there are a couple of hallmarks along the way which were significant, including the 1938 emphasis upon safety and the all-important Kefauver amendments of 1962, which brought drugs into the realm of not only being pure and relatively safe, but also effective. From a more, shall we say, legalistic outlook, forensic outlook, perhaps, the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, of course, is significant as far as opioids, as well as other powerful substances are concerned, particularly nervous acting drugs. And the technical name is the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which is too much to say, and so it's usually called the Controlled Substances Act. So one thing that I tried to do along the way in this particular presentation was to chronicle the attempts by the research and clinical communities to better understand various aspects of opioid action, and particularly dependency and tolerance. It was long recognized that significant problems were associated with opioid use, which dimmed uh, the, um, the clinical aspects of these substances to some degree. So the opioids are just classic in the sense of that balance that exists between what you want a particular drug substance to do and what you don't want it to do. And it's been a highlight of research to try to differentiate those better and worse aspects of the opioids, and to a very long time, uh, not a lot of significant progress occurred. It wasn't really until the field exploded there with the recognition of the endogenous substances, as well as the specific opioid receptors themselves, that much progress was made in that particular sense. So I've tried to uh, refer to a few historical points along the way to basically show the struggle which has occurred in terms of better understanding these drugs. And that struggle continues to this very moment, as we all know, because of the challenges that have occurred here just in the last few years. Um, so the first quote here is from 1680, quite a long time ago now. Among the remedies which pleased Almighty God to give to man to relieve his sufferings, so universal and efficacious as opium. Uh, that particular set of words doesn't really refer necessarily much to the adversities of the opioids themselves, but the opioids relieve sufferings and also produce some sufferings on their own. In the first edition of Goodman and Gilman, um, they stated that morphine is unequaled as an analgesic, and its indispensable employment in medicine and surgery is well defined, and that was very true. Although again, in that particular quotation, they didn't really refer to the adversities much, because there was little. We didn't even have opioid antagonists at that point, so there was little that could be done in terms of addressing adversity, other than trying to reduce doses and reduce time of administration. So, of course, the hallmark effects of the opioid are their analgesic properties, their ability to relieve pain. And sometimes the category is even titled that, opioid analgesics, even though analgesia itself is only one of many prominent activities that the opioids are capable of. So I stuck a slide in here, which I won't um, stick with long, because you folks are well oriented to the realm of pain and pain management. Um, but in the presentation that I designed this for, not everybody was on the footing that you folks are in terms of understanding pain. So just a reminder that pain is a very complex phenomenon in which there are sensational, perceptive, as well as affective or emotional components of pain. And it's really quite interesting to note, I think, that the opioids can address all three of these areas, but perhaps the greatest of these is the third one there, the affective component. As morphine and its analogs, both naturally occurring and synthetic, have tremendous impact in this area of affect or emotion, um, to the point that some individuals will even go as far as saying something like, well, under the influence of an opioid, I can still feel the pain, but I don't care anymore. And that's an indication of the affective aspect of the opioids. So enough of that. And this is just a little cartoon, a cartoon that came out of, by the way, that little publication that I showed you last week from the Society of Neuroscience on the nervous system. So this is a nice little pictorial recollection of those principles. So moving on in time into the early 1970s, I picked up Fred Meyer's book, his particular third edition of a review of medical pharmacology in 1972. And there's a couple of pieces of significance of using the Myers book. One is Myers was Leong Wei's colleague at UCSF, and Fred Myers um, based his practice out of the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic, which was a very interesting place for him to practice. And so there's a relationship between Myers and Katzung and Trevor, um, and as well as the fact that the Myers textbook itself evolved into the Katzung textbook a few years after this, when Dr. Myers retired. So if you ever pick up a review of medical pharmacology and take a look at it, it's one of those Lang books again, and looks a lot like the Katzung book. Although when Bert Katzung took over the book, he made substantial changes also relative to what Dr. Myers had done um, prior to that. So now we begin to address the broader range of both positive and negative aspects of the opioids, when Dr. Myers said the mechanism or mechanisms underlying tolerance and the abstinence syndrome, or in other words, withdrawal, are unknown. And so that's, about 50 years ago now, we well recognize the importance of tolerance and dependency, but really we're quite unsteady in terms of understanding mechanistically how that was accounted for in an underlying sense. He went on to say that to understand the epidemiology of opioid use, factors other than the unchanging pharmacological aspects of these drugs must be considered. That is a very significant statement. And of course, that sort of refers to what I was talking about in terms of sort of the more sociological aspects of opioid use as we were getting into this talk a few minutes ago. So during the middle aspects of this century, there were meeting after meeting as pharmacologists got together to try to understand developments that were occurring in the field and to gauge changes, that improvements that were occurring in terms of that understanding. One of these, which I was sort of midway along in terms of our time frame here, that I selected out was a meeting called the International Narcotics Research Conference. And by the way, notice that use of the terminology narcotics. Some people use the term narcotic as interchangeable with respect to the opioids. And that's why you see that particular terminology utilized in this particular case. However, might I point out, and I think you're all aware, that narcotic brings along a broader context also. and in a more forensic or legal sense, um, a variety of other drug substances are included under the narcotic label, including things like um, uh, cocaine and cannabis. Um, but from a pharmacological standpoint, uh, probably the more appropriate terminology and that which is more commonly utilized now, rather than narcotic, is opioid, in referring to the um, naturally occurring as well as synthetic relatives of opiate. Um, Still problematic there at the time of this conference. Note the quote: the fundamental problems of tolerance and physical dependence were only minimally addressed at this particular conference. Hopefully, future meetings of the of the group will provide a forum to reveal these advances. So it's interesting if you look at the papers and abstracts which were presented at that particular conference. Very few of them deal at that point with tolerance and physical dependence, because I think the field had just sort of grown weary of trying to find out the answers about these things without huge successes. Um, but that was beginning to change at that point. And so as we go on, now we'll look at edition of Goodman and Gilman, which is much closer to the one that we're using right now. They go on to say that modern neuroscience has increased our understanding of, and then they use the terminology addiction. The more strongly reinforcing a drug is, the greater is the likelihood that the drug is abused. And that, of course, refers to the rewarding aspects of the opioids as well as other substances. And so, as we've talked about in class, the reward reinforcement systems in our brains are tremendously powerful in terms of dependency phenomena. And I'm not going to sort of get into sort of the arguments that occur about whether um, the utilization of a word like addiction is appropriate or not, but just note that there's considerable discussion that occurs about what the right terminology is, and in current DSM designations, they really don't like the term addiction anymore, although it's still a very prominently used term, both in the pharmacological community and the more regulatory legalistic community. In this edition, they went on to say that reinforcing properties are associated with the capacity to increase neuronal activity in critical brain areas, uh, dopamine in the ventral striatum, i.e., the reward part of the reward pathway. So that brings us almost to the current time with Katzen. The Katzen book here, not G&G. Bert went on to say that in this particular edition of his textbook, that despite many controversies, progress now has occurred regarding potential underlying mechanisms. Addictive drugs increase dopamine concentration in targeted structures of the mesolimbic projection, and that high levels of dopamine may be at the origin of adaptive changes that underlie dependency and addiction. Well, we've talked about Bob and James before, and James, of course, if you recall, was a heroin addict, and the cat named Bob was his wonderful colleague in meeting some of the stressful situations associated with overcoming that particular dependency. That's a cute shot. I hope if anybody is feeling too much stress this afternoon, they could take a look at Bob and get a chuckle out of that. Street musicians in the city of London, England. So here's the DSM, and as I mentioned the other day in other types of related coverage, and then again here this afternoon, the DSM is a very significant publication in terms of identifying the problems that occur in a variety of nervous system related areas, including drug uh, dependency. They like using the terminology drug misuse now, I think, relative to other pieces of terminology. So here's just a few things to remember about the DSM. And I tried to emphasize that bit of a shift that's occurred from the American Psychiatric Association in terms of words that they utilize to describe these phenomena, and moving away from the sort of loaded terminology of addiction and toward utilization of the terminology substance use disorder for opioids as well as other drug substances. So getting into the more molecular aspects of this now, all known opioid receptors at this stage are G protein coupled receptors. And I'm not going to really review the rest of that verbiage here because you folks are all quite familiar with G protein coupled receptors. The work of Snyder and Pert dates back to as we talked about, the early 1970s. And I think they had a paper in Science in 1973, which really was the kickoff to this particular area. Current terminology, if you go about 2/3 of the way down, about three main subtypes for opioid receptors within the realm of the G protein coupled receptors, and then additional subtypes within those areas. And who knows, in the long run, perhaps other opioid receptors will be identified. I seriously doubt that in any pharmacological area, opioids or otherwise, that we reach the end of the line in terms of identifying receptor subtypes. I think more of these will be presented to our understanding in upcoming decades. Of course, there's differential distribution of these various subtypes in various brain regions. And finally, crystal structures are becoming available in this area, which leads to much greater potential for advancement from a molecular structural standpoint. But it was a long time in coming. And although there was a crystal structure for rhodopsin available for a long period of time, it wasn't until crystal structures for the adrenergic receptors came out that really the explosion in crystal structures was occurring, including now, of course, crystal structures for serotonin receptors, opioid receptors, and many others. So the mu opioid receptor is perhaps the one that you hear the most about because it's the one that has the most to do with the prominent analgesic properties of the prototypical opioid morphine, and therefore a lot of emphasis has gone into understanding the mu opioid receptor. Like a lot of other receptors that we've become familiar with, it actually works as a dimer, and those can be either hetero or homodimers, which expands the pharmacology in this area out tremendously, which I'm referring to there with the number of possible subtypes that exist. From a differential distribution standpoint, a spinal cord, the linings of the ventricles, and in the periphery, the gut, are prominent places for finding the mu receptors. And the efficacy of these receptors was, of course, known long before the receptors were known themselves. So I think we're approaching some time limits here right now. I would like to pause at this moment and see if anybody has any questions or additions that you would like to make before we call it good for the day. Anybody have any thoughts? So let me just note one thing before we stop, and that is that as time goes on and we evolve our thoughts about various receptors, uh, there can be changes that occur in terms of those designations. And so we saw that back in the serotonin 5-HT2 area, where the current 5-HT2C receptor at one time was identified as a 5-HT1A. Same sort of thing has happened a little bit with respect to the opioids. And at one point, the so-called sigma receptor was viewed as an opioid receptor. It's now not typically designated as an opioid receptor, but note particular prominence as far as the dissociative anesthetics, phencyclidine and ketamine are concerned. So that's a good place to stop. I think we'll stop there now. I won't see many of you again until after the election. So have a great election day, everybody. And Katie and I will see you again in class next week on Wednesday. Be safe in the meantime. Thank you.